I am a woman of science, someone who believes in facts rather than superstitions, and my work leaves no room for doubts or emotions. I am dedicated to unraveling the secrets of lifeless bodies. My role is to observe, document, and finally close the final chapter of those who can no longer tell their own story. I have spent years in this morgue, enduring endless and solitary shifts, and the routine has become as familiar as breathing. But that night, something shattered the logic that anchored me so firmly. I never imagined that, at the foot of the cold and silent autopsy table, I would begin to question how solid what we consider real truly is. That night, I was alone in the morgue, and the silence was oppressive, thick, as if something invisible was slowly crushing me. It was that kind of silence charged with presences, where even the slightest noise takes on an unsettling depth. I had just finished the reports for a particularly complicated autopsy. The body had arrived that very afternoon, a middle-aged man, a victim of a hit-and-run. He was so mangled that he barely retained a trace of humanity. I never felt good about these kinds of cases, but after years as a forensic pathologist, I had learned to slip into professional neutrality, to close my eyes to the emotional weight of my work. The clock hands were slowly approaching midnight, and exhaustion was already taking over my thoughts. I crossed the room with the intention of making one last check of the storage units before heading home. The cold of the refrigeration unit greeted me with an almost invigorating touch. As I walked among the perfectly aligned cadaver trays, I noticed something out of place. One of the trays at the back of the room wasn't completely closed. It was ajar by just a few centimeters, enough for a strip of stainless steel to peek through the gap. I felt a chill. Something wasn't right. I remembered checking all the trays, ensuring they were properly closed. I approached carefully, and the low hum of the refrigeration blended with the pounding of my heart, which had begun to quicken. My first thought was that it could be a mechanical failure, a faulty latch. It wouldn't be the first time. The morgue equipment had its imperfections. However, a deep sense of unease began to form in the pit of my stomach as I reached for the tray. I felt the icy cold of the handle before grasping it. Then, something made me stop. I examined the latch and noticed it was forced. The clasp was bent and scratched, as if someone had tried to pry it open with a tool. This wasn't an accident. Someone had been here. But how? I was the only person on the night shift, and all the doors were locked. My heart raced as I tried to rationalize what I saw, but I found no logical explanation. Access was strictly restricted, and yet someone had tampered with the lock. I pushed the tray back in and secured it carefully. Without losing a moment, I headed to the security room at the end of the hall. I entered the access code and examined the camera footage. The room appeared empty throughout the night, still and sterile. The playback seemed normal, but when I reached 11:30, I noticed something that made me hold my breath. A flash of static on the camera, as if the image had been interrupted for a second. I watched the recording more closely. It wasn't enough to be alarming under normal circumstances, but now that slight flicker felt like a hole in reality. Fear began to morph into something deeper, a dense and dark sensation. The room was in total calm, but for some reason, I felt as though I wasn't alone. I slowly returned to the main room, my mind tangled in the images, the camera flicker, and the forced lock. Suddenly, an intense cold swept over me, and a strange silence enveloped the atmosphere, heavier, denser. A slight breeze brushed my skin. I looked around. All the corpses were in their place, every tray closed, every shadow in its spot. And then I heard it. It was a soft whisper, barely perceptible, something that at first might have been mistaken for the buzzing of fluorescent lights. But it wasn't that. It was a faint voice, almost a murmur, coming from the back of the room, from the tray I had found open. A shiver ran down my spine. The voice murmured unintelligible words, something dragged out, as if it did not belong to the world of the living. Against all logic, my legs moved toward the source of the whisper. My breath was shallow, each step resonating like thunder in the morgue's silence. I approached the tray and, almost against my will, extended my hand to open it again. I pulled on the handle, and the tray slowly slid outward. What I saw was so disturbing that my hands began to tremble. There, on the cold stainless steel surface, was the body of the man from the accident, just as I had left it before. But his face was no longer deformed. He was looking directly at me, his eyes open, empty, but fixed on mine, and a strange, faint smile curved his shattered lips. That smile stretched into an impossible grimace. I instinctively recoiled, but tripped and fell to the floor. When I got back up, I noticed that the body had moved slightly, as if it had tried to sit up. His hands, once rigid, now hung over the edges of the tray. A chill raced through me as a muffled, mocking laughter flooded the morgue's air, echoing in every corner, as if it came from every tray, from every shadow. I turned to run, but my legs felt anchored to the ground. I tried to pull away, stumbling and feeling cold sweat trickle down my back. As I reached the door, a final whisper, clear and sharp, cut through the air.
I'll see you tomorrow.
I stumbled out, barely aware of my steps. I reached the security room, feeling my skin taut and cold, and I turned off the lights in the morgue. Before closing the door, I took one last look into the dark room and saw that the tray was open again. And the smile was still there, waiting for me. Since that night, I have never been alone in the morgue again.
In the morgue, time seems to stand still, and the echoes of life fade away between the sterile walls where silence reigns supreme. For those of us who work here, death becomes a routine. But that night, something shattered the meticulous calm of my work. A case that appeared to be just another turned into an abyss of unease that threatened to pull me into something darker. As I reviewed the evidence, I began to sense the disturbing presence of a hidden, lurking intention that unsettled my perception of reality. That night, I was alone, sifting through the records of a recent case. A young man, hit in a hit-and-run, had arrived without identification and with barely a few belongings. The police were searching for clues, but the cameras in the area had only captured the fleeing vehicle. As I examined the deceased's clothing, I found something unexpected in the pocket of his jacket. It was a crumpled note. I thought it would be a receipt or worthless trash until I unfolded the paper and read the first words. My name, scrawled in trembling, hurried handwriting, Dr. Samuel. My heart raced. How could a stranger know my name? And what was written in that note struck me like a dagger to the chest. I don't have much time. They know about your family. Lydia, Anna, take care of them. They are watching you. I stepped back, almost dropping the paper. Lydia and Anna were the names of my wife and daughter. Information that no one outside my inner circle could possibly know. The air in the autopsy room grew thick. I looked at the corpse, searching for answers in its vacant face. A man I had never seen in my life, but who seemed to know every detail of mine. I quickly turned to the fingerprint system, searching for a match in the database. The screen flickered, and time seemed to slow as the system processed. In the midst of the wait, I decided to review the case files. What I found was even more disconcerting. The autopsy notes, which I had written myself the night before, were altered. The wounds, the angle of the impact, the description, every detail was subtly changed, just enough to make me doubt my own memory. I called my supervisor, explaining the situation with as much calm as I could muster, though inside I felt a chilling panic. The note, the changes in the report, the sensation of being watched. Something or someone was manipulating every element of this case. We reviewed the security footage from the previous night, searching for any signs of unauthorized access, any hint of activity. To our surprise, the monitors showed absolute emptiness. The cameras had not captured any movement at all. As we watched the recording, I noticed something chilling. At one moment during the autopsy, a shadow peeked into the edge of the camera, watching me from a distance. My supervisor and I exchanged incredulous glances. No one had entered the morgue all night, yet that shadow was there, right at the edge of perception, as if something had been watching us. That same night, I returned to the lab, obsessed with finding answers. Each time I reviewed the details, each change in the notes, each alteration in the evidence, I felt a presence brushing against me, a force that challenged me, seeming to anticipate each of my movements. I tried to rationalize, to think that perhaps it was all a mistake, that maybe fatigue was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something more was happening. It was as if someone or something was mocking my disbelief, as if this presence in the morgue wanted to leave me a message whose dark magnitude I had yet to comprehend. For weeks, the presence persisted, with subtle changes that seemed to be only for my eyes. A slight disorder in the documents, instruments out of place, a shadow at the edge of my vision. We never managed to identify the man or decipher the origin of that note. And each time I returned to the morgue, I felt that penetrating gaze waiting. Now, every night when I leave, I feel its weight as a silent warning. Maybe one day the truth will be revealed. Maybe not. But every time I cross the door of the morgue in the cold abyss that envelops me, I know that someone or something has been here, leaving me alone with the void, in a game that only death understands.
Since I began working as a forensic pathologist, I learned that death never comes alone. It always brings its own secrets. The morgue, with its solemn silence and cold walls, is a kind of sanctuary for those mysteries. There, under the unrelenting fluorescent light, I have dissected hidden stories, tearing answers from silent bodies. But there are nights when even the dead seem to want to keep something to themselves. This was one of those nights. I felt it in the air, heavy and expectant, as if an invisible whisper were lingering in the shadows. It was past midnight, that hour when even the dead seemed to rest more peacefully. The morgue was silent, save for the dull hum of the ventilation system and the occasional clatter of my instruments. I leaned over the body of a young man in his 20s, brutally stabbed in an alley, his wounds narrating a fury so excessive it felt almost personal. The police wanted answers, but I could only think about how unsettling the atmosphere felt that night. I was alone. The sterile white light illuminated every corner, but the weight of an invisible gaze bore down on my neck, as if someone were watching me from the shadows. I glanced at the observation window, the one detectives sometimes use to follow the procedure, and confirmed that no one was there. The door was closed, and I hadn't heard anyone come in. I forced myself to return to the body, to focus on the wounds and the angle of the cuts, but the sensation persisted, like a subtle pressure at the edges of my mind. Each time I turned to grab an instrument, that uncomfortable feeling intensified, becoming more tangible, almost real. It seemed impossible, but I found myself stealing quick glances over my shoulder, as if at any moment something might emerge from the gloom. I felt like I wasn't alone. After what felt like an eternity, I completed the autopsy. But that feeling of unease, which usually disappeared when I closed the final suture, lingered that night. Before leaving, I decided to check the security recordings. I needed to confirm that I was alone, that this was all a trick of the shadows, a result of accumulated fatigue. The security room was deserted. I quickly fast-forwarded the recording of the autopsy room, watching my own figure hunched over the body, alone, in the sterile, silent space. At first, everything appeared normal. But as the footage progressed, something startled me. In a fleeting instant, while examining one of the wounds, a shadow moved in the background, just beyond the observation window. My heart stopped. I replayed the recording at a slower speed, and there it was. A tall figure, broad-shouldered, watching me from the other side of the glass. There was no face, just a heavy, dark shadow, motionless, yet radiating an intensity that froze my blood. It was as if those invisible eyes had been boring into me throughout the entire autopsy. I advanced the recording over and over, watching how the figure remained still, silently observing me. Then, when I turned to leave the room in the recording, the figure faded away, disappearing into the shadows as if it had never been there. My hands trembled as I stopped the video. I reviewed the security logs with the staff the next day. There was no trace of activity in the observation room. No one had used their access cards, and the cameras showed the door closed all night. And yet, I knew someone had been watching me. I knew that, although I couldn't prove it, I had felt that presence with every fiber of my being. That night, I returned to the morgue with the sensation that someone was waiting for me. As I walked down the cold hallway, a certainty washed over me that almost made me stop. That stranger in the darkness was not just any intruder. No, it was something much older. Something that fed on secrets, fears, and every decomposed body I left in that room. The weight of that invisible gaze was there, waiting, knowing that I felt it too, aware that perhaps one day it wouldn't be me performing the autopsy, but the body lying on the table.